Something unusual happened on Russian state television recently. The people who normally spend their airtime celebrating battlefield victories and mocking Ukrainian setbacks suddenly turned their anger inward. Military commentators, the same voices who have spent years reassuring viewers that everything is under control, started openly saying that Russia is losing this war. Not to a foreign anchor, not in a leaked document, but on camera, in real time, in front of a domestic audience that has been told for years the opposite story. Their argument centered on money. They pointed out that enormous sums, hundreds of millions of euros, continue to flow toward football clubs and other leisure activities, while Russian oil refineries burn. Their claim was simple. Redirect a fraction of that spending and refinery defenses could be fixed. But one prominent analyst went further, warning that the country is effectively drinking beer and watching football while the rest of the world prepares for a confrontation with Russia. It's a striking image, deliberately provocative, meant to shame the political and business elite into action. But the anger on television is really a symptom of something the state can no longer hide. Refinery shutdowns caused by Ukrainian strikes have piled up to the point where they now constitute a genuine national fuel crisis. Russian oil refining output has fallen to its lowest level in more than 2 decades. Think about what that actually means. This is one of the largest oil-producing and exporting nations on the planet, and it has been reduced to importing refined fuel products from abroad, just to keep its own domestic market functioning. That is not a minor logistical hiccup. That is a structural failure with visible consequences. Long lines at gas stations, rationing, and reports of confrontations between ordinary citizens fighting over limited fuel supplies. When people are arguing at the pump, the state's ability to manage basic distribution is visibly cracking, and that is a far more dangerous political problem than any single lost battle. So why can't Russia simply fix its air defense and end this problem? The commentators are right that there's a crisis, but they are diagnosing it too narrowly. The real issue is structural, not financial. Russia has too few air defense systems to cover too much territory, and Ukraine understands this and exploits it constantly. Every day, layers of drone attacks force Russian defenses to expend their most expensive interceptor missiles against machines that often cost a small fraction of the price to build. Even when Russia wins the exchange and shoots the drone down, it loses economically, and it loses inventory that cannot be quickly replaced. Meanwhile, Russian industry keeps producing offensive systems, additional missiles for platforms like the S-400 launch families, rather than prioritizing the interceptors that would actually help close the defensive gap. That's a telling choice. It suggests a mindset still oriented toward offense and prestige, rather than the basic protection of critical infrastructure. This imbalance has let Ukrainian drones push deeper and deeper into Russian territory. Russia's mobile air defense teams, which rely on spotting targets visually and getting into position in time, simply cannot cover every gap. Some analysts have proposed interceptor drones as a partial fix, but even that solution depends on a well-integrated detection and communication network, and that's precisely where the system breaks down. Low-flying drones can exploit the terrain and slip through gaps between radar coverage zones. Even when one is detected, the information has to travel from a radar operator to a regional command post, and then out to a unit that can actually respond. And by the time that chain completes, the window to intercept has often already closed. Ukraine has learned to exploit this delay methodically. Rather than a single wave of drones, Ukraine sends repeated, smaller swarms from multiple directions, essentially probing the system to see where radar emissions light up, which batteries respond, and how quickly. Over time, this builds a detailed picture of Russian defensive patterns, information that gets used in follow-up strikes. Decoy drones add another layer to this strategy, forcing Russian defenders to burn through scarce interceptor missiles and reveal the location of batteries that would otherwise remain hidden. Once those defenses are sufficiently worn down, Ukraine escalates with much larger attacks, sometimes involving several hundred drones at once, following the routes that earlier waves have already mapped out. To make matters even harder for Russian operators, Ukraine blends different types of aerial threats together. Fast, jet-powered drones, slower propeller drones, and occasionally cruise missiles, all approaching at different speeds and altitudes. Distinguishing a decoy from a genuine threat under those conditions, in real time, is an enormously difficult problem, and that difficulty is precisely the point. So the Russian commentators who are furious about football sponsorships are not wrong that resources are being misallocated, but their solution, essentially reshuffling a budget line, misunderstands the scale of the problem. Even if refineries were fully secured tomorrow by pulling money from civilian spending, Ukraine would simply shift its targeting toward other valuable military or industrial sites. The vulnerability isn't really about refineries specifically. It's about the fact that Russia is enormous, and its size, which has traditionally been considered a strategic advantage, has become a liability in this kind of war. A vast territory means more approach routes for drones, more potential targets to defend, and more distance between defended zones. No amount of budget reallocation changes the physics of that problem. Russia simply doesn't have enough systems, and it cannot manufacture new ones fast enough to keep pace with the rate at which Ukraine is destroying or exhausting existing ones. There's also a political dimension that makes this worse. Air defense assets have reportedly been concentrated heavily around symbolic and politically sensitive locations, including Moscow itself and locations tied to the country's leadership. That concentration reveals a clear set of priorities. Protecting the appearance of control and the safety of the leadership matters more, in practical terms, than protecting oil infrastructure or military-industrial sites elsewhere in the country. Every launcher assigned to guarding a symbolic target is one that isn't available to guard a refinery, a factory, or a supply depot. Ukraine can exploit that gap simply by not attacking the heavily defended symbolic sites and instead going after everything else. What we're witnessing, then, is a rare moment of candor, breaking through a system that usually prefers confident messaging. The fact that state-aligned commentators are willing to say publicly that the current approach is failing tells you that the consequences, fuel shortages, public frustration, visible battlefield losses, have become too large to paper over with the usual talking points. Their anger is genuine and, in a narrow sense, justified. But the proposed fixes miss the deeper truth. This isn't a story about football clubs stealing money that should have gone to refinery defense. It's a story about a country whose air defense architecture was never built to withstand a war fought at this tempo, with this many cheap, expendable threats launched this persistently against this much territory. Every successful strike forces Moscow into an uncomfortable choice about which vulnerability to accept next, and there is no version of budget reshuffling that makes that choice go away. It's worth pausing on why this particular moment of public frustration matters more than earlier complaints. Russian military bloggers and commentators have grumbled about specific failures before, a botched offensive here, a slow logistics chain there. Those complaints tend to fade quickly because they can be framed as isolated incidents, the fault of a particular commander or a particular unit. What's different this time is the scope of the admission. Describing the refining sector as operating at its weakest point in 21 years isn't a story about one bad month. It's an admission that an entire economic sector, central to both the war effort and the domestic economy, has been systematically degraded over an extended period, and that the systems meant to protect it were not adequate to the task from the outset. There's also a psychological dimension worth considering. For years, Russian state media built an image of overwhelming military capability, layered air defenses, advanced radar networks, an industrial base that could outproduce its opponents. When commentators who helped construct that image start contradicting it on air, it signals that the gap between the official narrative and the lived reality has grown too wide to bridge with rhetoric alone. Ordinary citizens waiting in fuel lines don't need a military analyst to tell them something is wrong. They're already living the consequence. What the on-air panic actually reflects is elite awareness catching up to public experience. And elites admitting failure publicly is usually a sign that the failure has become too large and too visible to manage quietly through internal channels. It also raises a longer-term question about adaptation. Militaries facing an asymmetric drone threat generally have a few paths available. Mass-produce cheaper interceptors, invest heavily in network detection so that response times shrink, or accept losses in less critical areas while concentrating defenses around the highest value targets. Russia's current posture looks like an uneasy mix of the second and third options, without fully committing to either. Talk of interceptor drones suggests recognition that cheap countermeasures are needed, but without the sensor fusion and command integration to make them effective quickly, they risk becoming another underused asset rather than a genuine solution. And the visible concentration of defenses around symbolic sites suggests a partial retreat into protecting what matters politically rather than what matters militarily or economically, which is a defensible short-term survival strategy for a leadership worried about its own image, but a poor strategy for sustaining a long war of attrition against an opponent who keeps finding the gaps. None of this means the war is decided by these dynamics alone. Wars are rarely won or lost purely on the strength of an air defense network, and Russia retains substantial resources, manpower, and industrial depth that shouldn't be dismissed. But the specific complaint aired by Russian commentators, that leisure spending should have gone toward defense instead, is a distraction from the more uncomfortable reality underneath it. The problem isn't a misallocated line item in a budget. It's a mismatch between the scale of the country being defended and the number of systems available to defend it, compounded by a production strategy still weighted toward offense and a political instinct that prioritizes symbolic safety over functional resilience. That combination is what continues to let Ukrainian strikes land, refinery output continues to fall, and citizens keep waiting in longer lines for less fuel. However, this conflict eventually resolves. The fact that state-aligned voices are now saying these things openly is itself a meaningful data point about where things currently stand.